What if the Constitution no longer applied? What if the government could write any law, regulate any behavior, and tax any event? What if you could love your country, but hate what the government has done to it? What if Jefferson was right? What if that government is best which governs least? What if freedom's greatest hour of danger is now?
Yeah, I love the judge.
Oh.
I just think he's great.
You know what? You know why? Because you can tell he's always talking the truth.
And he makes sense.
Right. Absolutely. So welcome back to Perspectives. The time is 3:06. Wow.
Hi, Kate.
On by. Hi, Carl Lamar. We've got Dave Dodderidge in studio. Hey. And we also have a very special guest. Whoops, sorry about that. We also have a very special guest, Brandon Turbeville. How are you, Brandon?
I'm doing good, Kate. Thanks for having me on.
Excellent. I'm really excited about this. Thanks to Dave for contacting you and getting you on the show. This is wonderful for us because I've read some of the articles that you've written. Obviously you've authored many books. You are from Mullins, South Carolina. You have a bachelor's degree from Francis Marion University. You're the author of, there's 3 books here, but I know there's more than this, isn't there? Codex Alimentarius, right? The End of Health Freedom, 7 Real Conspiracies, and 5 Cent Solutions. You've published over 100 articles dealing with a wide variety of subjects, including health, economics, government corruption, and civil liberties. Welcome to the show, Brandon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think that bio may be just a little bit old. I should mention that since we're going to talk about the situation in Syria, I've got a book called The Road to Damascus, The Anglo-American Assault on Syria, which I think people might be interested in.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
This is a good read. I've been reading up on this.
The subtitle.
Yes, I've been reading up on this, and this is really one of the main reasons we wanted to have you on the show too, because there is so much misinformation. There are so many things not talked about in the media.
What do you mean, the Anglo-American assault on Syria?
Well, essentially, the subtitle is based on the fact that what is happening in Syria is not an organic rebellion. It never was. It was not. There is no such thing as moderate rebellions in Syria. This is an assault against the secular government of Bashar al-Assad, and it's conducted by the West, mainly by the United States and NATO. That includes Britain, France, Germany, but especially Britain and France. And, of course, with its regional allies, the Saudi Arabians, Qatar, Kuwait, some of the feudal monarchies there in the Middle East and the Arabian areas, as well as Israel. So this is especially Turkey, too, which, of course, is a NATO member. So that's what I mean by the Anglo-American assault. It's conducted by the West. It's conducted by the United States. It's conducted by NATO against Assad. And I think what people need to understand is that, again, there is no such thing as a moderate opposition in Syria, and there never was. In fact, the entire movement, the entire Arab Spring, I guess, is what it was being referred to as, the tail end of the Arab Spring. But this was entirely violent from the beginning. This was not a bunch of peaceful protesters who wanted to, camp out in the park and have all kinds of democratic activity. This was a gang of killers from the very beginning, from the very first day of the so-called protest in Syria. This was violent. In my book, I have these reports documented, but we had journalists that went over to Syria to investigate, and from the very first day, there were individuals who were shooting police, shooting military soldiers, and on the rooftops of buildings like those in Homs, and they were shooting men, women, and children just randomly. There were kids on their way to school, there were women on the way to the market, there were doctors on the way to the hospital, and they were being sniped at from the so-called Syrian rebels, the Syrian opposition. Now, most of these Syrian rebels are not even Syrian. I think that's what people need to realize as well. And they never were, right? They were brought in from Libya. This was the tail end of after Gaddafi was overthrown, another Anglo-American assault. They were brought in from Libya, they were brought in from Saudi Arabia, and then eventually from all over the world, right? We've got them coming from just about every country in the world. A lot of them are coming from NATO countries for the purposes of overthrowing Assad. And as you can see, it's escalated over the last 3 to 4 years. So that's the reason for the title. And, that was a long answer to that.
Well, you realize heads are exploding out there because, you can't. I think with our media telling us what that narrative is 24/7 on the media channels, we're getting a completely different story. And so I'm sure heads are exploding because it's hard to fathom that we would be behind something in any way, isn't it? I mean, we have such a hard time understanding this.
Well, it may be for some people because, unfortunately, what's being put out through mainstream outlets is this sort of imbecilic idea of history and this idea that, the exceptional people who never do anything wrong. But look at Libya. Look at what happened to Libya. This is openly admitted, right? That we overthrew Gaddafi, and look at the country now. Syria was the next target. And in fact, if you want to look at an article in the New York Times by Ben Hubbard, it was in April 2013. Ben Hubbard was looking at these so-called moderate rebels, and he even stated in the article that there was nowhere in Syria a secular fighting force. There were no moderates. And again, I think people really need to get this through their heads because when the media refers to moderate rebels, again, it's a farce, it's a lie, but when they refer to them as moderate rebels, the people that they're generally talking about is the Free Syrian Army. Now, if you go do a basic Google search, you'll come up with endless atrocities committed by the Free Syrian Army, beheadings. They had these burial brigades, which were essentially death squads that would go into town and murder people who supported the government. Of course, they implemented Sharia law wherever they went. It's been openly admitted also, the Free Syrian Army, by Basil Idris, one of the commanders of the Free Syrian Army, not Salam, but Basil. He admitted that they're working with al-Nusra and ISIS. We had Abu Fida, who was also a member of the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian Revolutionary Council, who said that they also were working with ISIS and al-Nusra. So it's important to know that there is no difference between the Free Syrian Army and all the other groups working in and among Syria and Iraq. And so you got al-Nusra, you've got ISIS, you've got all these groups, but they're the same thing. And I think that's one of the main things I want people to take away from this show is that, ISIS, ISIL, al-Nusra, the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant, Free Syrian Army, all these guys are exactly the same, and they take orders from exactly the same people. And so, again, the connections there between the Free Syrian Army and Nusra and ISIS are legion. But, this guy, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, I don't know if you've heard of him, but yes. He goes by a new name now. He has Khalif Ibrahim, but it's the same thing. He was an Iraqi who fought against Saddam Hussein. All right, he was a member of Al-Qaeda, and he fought against Saddam Hussein. Now that might surprise a lot of people, but Al-Qaeda was trying to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and he was fighting them. But when the U.S. invaded, the Baghdadi became famous for a lot of his atrocities in Iraq, and he killed a bunch of Shiites, took over a bunch of cathedrals and ushered in Sharia law and so forth. He was arrested and taken to Camp Bucca for about 4 years. And when he came back, he was made the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And this Al-Qaeda in Iraq changed its name to the Islamic Emirate of Iraq. Okay, and then it had sort of the Islamic Emirate of Iraq was obviously the Iraqi version, and in Syria they had something called Al-Nusra Front, right? It was a division of the Islamic Emirate of Iraq, which was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now, it changed its name yet again to the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant, right? And the groups began to merge, and eventually that name got changed again to the the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIL. So Al-Qaeda in Iraq is the same thing as the Islamic Emirate of Iraq, same thing as al-Nusra, same thing as ISIS. So These groups, of course, they're fanatics, they're insane, they're absolute psychopaths. So they have to fight one another eventually. They're going to do that. That's the nature of the game at the lower levels. But at the higher levels, there is no difference between these groups. So
now, I remember reading a statement by a French physician who went down there and was working, and he stated that he's working with the rebel groups. And he stated that 70% of the casualties of people that he worked on were not Syrians.
Right. That's the thing. See, they brought a lot of them over from Libya. There's this area in Libya called Derna and Tobruk, which there's a lot of them were coming from these areas, a kind of a hotbed area of destabilization against Gaddafi. The United States and its allies were funding destabilizations against Gaddafi. In fact, the United States, which created al-Qaeda back in the late 1970s, and that's documented, not up for debate, used al-Qaeda to try to assassinate Gaddafi in the late 90s. And eventually it was done. Gaddafi was assassinated a few years ago by al-Qaeda, this Islamic, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, the LIFG, was al-Qaeda. And that was, well documented. And after Gaddafi was overthrown, they were moved from Libya over to Syria to do the same thing there. And you can see the results of that.
The geopolitical situation on this, and why are these groups, trying to take down Syria?
Well, there's a number of reasons it would take down Syria, and you got to look at these groups as the CIA's proxy army, right? You can call al-Qaeda the CIA's Arab Legion because that's what they've been since the late 1970s. They're a group of fanatics and fighters that are used to overthrow secular governments or whatever, any kind of governments that oppose the NATO idea of the way the world should work, the U.S. world hegemony, as Brzezinski, the creator of al-Qaeda, stated in his book. But one of the reasons is because Syria is one of the last sphere of influence countries of Russia, and that's very important. But they want to weaken Russia's influence in the region, and also there is this question of a Qatari pipeline, a pipeline that will come up through Qatar and go up from Qatar through Syria and on up into to Europe through Turkey and so forth. So if you look at the situation of Ukraine with the sanctions and Russia, for instance, Russia provides a lot of the gas to Europe. And right now there's leverage with Russia. If there is increased conflict there, Russia can always turn the spigot off and Europe will get very cold this winter. If that pipeline coming from Qatar goes up through Syria and into Europe, there is a backup method of achieving oil and heating for Europe. So that's one of the reasons they've got to have that pipeline. That reduces Russia's leverage over Europe. So it's important to also see that the ultimate goal here is actually not just Syria and Assad. The next country on the chopping block is, of course, Iran, but the ultimate goal here is a confrontation with Russia. And that's very dangerous for all of us.
Yeah.
Okay, so if the Western media outlets are promoting the side of these death squads, why? Why are we doing that? Why are we? Because it's ramping up. The news is ramping up every day. They're going to kill military people. Now it's a beheading. It seems like every other day. What is in it for our media to really support it, yeah, to really put it out there. I mean, it seems like every other day we've got new information on what ISIS is going to do next, and everybody's in fear. And where do the American people have that wrong?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said everybody's in a state of fear, and I think that is the point, right? Is to get everybody in an outrage over these beheadings, over the danger of possible terrorist attacks. And once you do that, you get people in a state where they're more ready to accept foreign wars, where they're more ready to accept a crackdown on their own civil liberties, where they're more ready to to sort of play ignorant to the fact that this economy is the worst that it's been since the Great Depression, and you're in a world economic depression. So it draws attention away from that. So there's a number of reasons. Now, why would the media do it? The media is owned by a number of very few corporations and banks as well. And of course, we know the CIA. There's this Operation Mockingbird that has its implants inside a lot of the major news organizations across the world, especially the United States. And in fact, that was openly admitted recently that they were going to ramp up those liaison operations. A lot of your newscasters and reporters are actually connected to the CIA and intelligence agencies. So it's a propaganda outfit, and that's all it is. And it works, unfortunately. It's worked time and time again against the American people. If the U.S. government was so concerned about terrorism coming to the United States and conducting these big terror attacks inside the United States, why haven't they closed the border? So.
Right. Exactly. No, you're exactly right. It's just like 9/11 ushered in the Patriot Act that was already prepared and ready to go. Same kind of thing, right? We're ready and welcome to take any kind of security that comes our way.
And whatever they offer. Was it Leon Panetta? Was he the one? He just said that the war's going to last 30 years.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Wow. That's really prepping us, isn't it?
Brandon, how is your message, the premise for your argument being received by media, or is media totally ignoring it?
Or by the people.
Or by the government? What's the reaction?
Well, I haven't heard much from the government. They're not big on responding to people these days. But you talk to the average person, to some degree, I think a lot of people are just befuddled because the real story on the ground is so different from the story that's actually being reported in the media, that I think a lot of people just kind of give up, and they take themselves out of the interaction, and they don't know what to think. Now, what I will say is that these polls that suggest that the American people are more ready to go to war in Syria now than they were last year, when when there was this false chemical weapons attack that they tried to blame on Assad, which was actually the death squads, the so-called rebels, that did it. I'm not convinced these polls are accurate, because everybody that I talk to tells me that they don't want to get involved. And I have seen very few people, real people, not the Congress critters or anything, but the real people. I've seen very few of them who said we need to go over to Syria to bomb for any reason. And I think the American people are sick of war. Unfortunately, propaganda does work, and apathy is sort of a tacit agreement to support these things. But
what's our end game? What's our end game? What do we really, really want over there?
Well, I think the end game, as I said, is a confrontation with Russia. And I think it's an attempt to break up Russia as a large country, to break it as this center of power in Europe. And, if you read the book, The Grand Chessboard by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the former national security advisor under Carter, he was Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations, advisor to a number of different presidents, including Obama. He's a pretty big deal. And he also was the creator of Al-Qaeda. And if anybody doubts that, they can go to YouTube and they can watch Zbigniew Brzezinski talking to the Mujahideen, as we called them then, but that's Al-Qaeda, and telling them that this is your war, this is a holy war. He used those words. And he even has admitted that in a number of different interviews. So if anybody doubts it, they can check it up. But Brzezinski said in his book, The Grand Chessboard, that the goal is to break Russia up into 3 different countries. One, a European Russia, one an Asian Russia, and one sort of a Eurasian country, kind of a blend between the two, but they would be separate. At the very best, they would be a confederacy, but he wanted to blend them into the European Union and some type of Asian Pacific cooperation or something like that, and to break the country up as it currently exists. And of course, Russia is not going to go gentle into that good night. They're not going to just accept this and say, oh, well, you want to break us up into 3 parts. Sure, we'll do it. No, Russia is not going to do that. They're a nuclear power as well, and that's why this is so dangerous. So people need to get a handle on this stuff and stop buying into the propaganda. One thing I'll say here is that this guy I just mentioned, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, on my website, brandonturbeville.com, you'll find an article that I've done about John McCain. And, John McCain's probably been the most vocal supporter of ISIS, of terrorism in the Congress. Yeah. And I've got pictures. We've got pictures on the website where John McCain is in a meeting with the so-called Syrian rebels. And one of the guys is Salam Idris, that's the commander of the Free Syrian Army. Remember the guys that implemented Sharia law and had a bunch of beheadings. The other guy is Abu Sakar. And if anybody remembers Abu Sakar, he's the guy who cut the heart out of the Syrian soldier and ate it for the camera. Mm-hmm. So I wonder how that dinner tasted.
With McCain?
Yes, the pictures are on my website. They took pictures together. And the other guy in the picture is Baghdadi. And at the time that McCain had his meeting with Baghdadi, the guy was already on the most wanted list. So maybe we should grill John McCain about material support to terrorism, because if I go on the wrong website, I can go to Guantanamo, but this guy can sit with terrorists and he can go back to a Senate seat. Now, I don't think that that's fair.
Wow.
So again, if we're concerned about national security, I haven't seen John McCain grilled yet.
Yeah. What got you into this, Brendan? I mean, what led you down this road to seek the truth and try and figure out what was really going on? What was that moment?
I've always been a curious person, I guess. But, as far as Syria goes, I followed it from the beginning because you could tell what was going on after the Libya situation. But, I've always been kind of a curious person. So I just have been following this type of stuff for some time.
I think I mentioned to you that I've been to Syria. I visited twice back in 2006. And the people there, I spoke to cab drivers and people on the street. Many were disgruntled with Bashar Assad, but it's kind of like the way we feel about Obama. Mm-hmm. But revolution wasn't far from their minds, at that time. I have a question for you, though. Vladimir Putin must have been, or at least advised of Brzezinski's book and know what the Grand Chessboard and the plan is. What do you think, Russia, are they in preparation? What kind of moves or counter moves are they making on this Grand Chessboard?
Well, I think what's very concerning to Russia right now is Ukraine, way more than Syria, simply because of the proximity to the country and the fact that that NATO is trying to push itself literally right up to Russia's borders and aiming intercontinental ballistic missiles at Russia and that sort of thing. There are counter moves, obviously. We've seen with the chemical weapons situation, we've seen Putin judo NATO a few times, right, where they came in and at the last minute and came up with an agreement to get rid of the chemical weapons. In terms of the sanctions, there's a lot of internal discussions in Russia. There's this guy Glaziev, who is a close advisor to Putin, and they're discussing basically renationalizing their central banks and issuing Russian currency. Right now, the Russian banking system is kind of tied to the Federal Reserve dollar system, and that's not good for Russia.
Yeah, they're trying to break away right now, right?
Yeah, they're breaking away from the dollar gradually. Although if they follow Glaziev's program, then that actually could accelerate it a good deal. So I think a lot of it's going to be economic. But again, you've gotten a few warnings from Russian military command, just little reminders here and there that Russia is a nuclear power. And can't stress that enough. Ukraine is not worth it. In fact, if you want to talk about, color revolutions and destabilizations, Ukraine is one, right? Because you have the United States, which created that Euromaidan protest. That was not an organic revolution either. We created that to overthrow Yanukovych, and because he was working closer with Russia in terms of a loan deal. He rejected the IMF and the austerity programs there. So he rejected the IMF, and immediately he was overthrown with the Euromaidan protesters, who were not peaceful hippies wanting to camp out in the park. They were Nazis, And you can see all that now, literal Nazis. And of course, John McCain is a big fan of those guys as well. But you know, John McCain's not the center of the universe, but it's just funny to point out.
Just thinks he is. Yeah.
No, it just seems pretty hard to wrap our minds around that the United States, the NATO, GCC could be funding the terrorists.
That we're supposed to live in fear of, and the reason that we would go to war.
Right. It's hard to wrap my brain around this.
What's your take on Obama? Do you feel like he, and the way he is orchestrating his take or his reaction to everything? Do you think some people think he has a plan. Some people think he is just not aware. What's your take?
Well, he has a plan, and that is to do whatever his puppet masters tell him to do, and then go hide in the corner. So,
on the golf course.
Yeah,
right. Hang out on the golf course. So, right. I'm not under any illusion that a president at this day and age has any real power, any real control over things. That this is a guy that stands up at the top that we can throw tomatoes at whenever we get upset. But at the end of the day, he's no different than George W. Bush. In fact, since we were talking about Syria, George did this plan to overthrow Assad. This funding of terrorists and death squads in Syria went as far back as 2005. So this was discussed under the Bush administration as well. So Bush administration, Obama administration, no difference between the two, except that things get progressively worse. But that's that's the name of the game at this point. So that's my opinion on Obama. But
yeah, I agree. Actually agree with you.
Yeah, recently in the news, the Kurds are bombing of ISIS, and Turkey, Erdogan, and those Kurds are trying to defend themselves and things like that. This seems to be the latest thing that's happening. Can you tell us what's happening there on the border?
Well, what's happening on the border is that you got to go back and talk about where this stuff started, right? Because these terrorists came in from the Turkish border. It's not that they're trying to go into Turkey. That's where they came from. In fact, there were a number of European news outlets that came out in, I think, 2012, where there were about tens of thousands of fighters death squad fighters that later turned out to be ISIS. The mainstream press was shocked 2 years later when they finally reported on it here in the U.S. But these fighters were ISIS fighters. There were tens of thousands of them that were brought in and trained in Jordan by the United States and NATO and the intelligence agencies and that organizations, but particularly the United States, trained by NATO, funded by Saudi Arabia, and then brought into Turkey. And when they were brought into Turkey, they went down from Turkey and they came in at least two different border crossings, but they focused on one in Latakia, which is in sort of the northwestern part of Syria, the coastal area. And when they came across the border, they were aided by Turkish jets that were helping to act as air cover, and also on another occasion Israeli jets that were helping to act as air cover against the Assad government there to get the terrorists in. After that initial invasion, they were moved to the other side of Turkey and brought in near the Syrian and Iraqi border, and that's how they progressed into Iraq. And gained so much territory there. Of course, if you listen to mainstream reports, they will tell you that the United States had no idea that ISIS was taking over a third of the country. Right. Now, the NSA is listening to your every phone call and email, but they don't know that ISIS is taking over Iraq.
Right. I agree with you. It's preposterous.
Yeah.
So if you were to, I'm sure you're a chess player. You're obviously very, very bright. So. Okay, what would the next move be? What do you think our next move, and what will we be hearing from the media in, say, a week or two? I'm not trying to get you to forecast the future, but in a way, what would be the next step? What would be, as far as this plan goes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think what you're going to see is the creation of some type of buffer zone and a no-fly zone, or at least the attempt to do it. Now, we've seen that in the news recently.
Okay.
The idea is I guess if I could take just a step back to answer your question, I rambled for a minute, but I needed to talk about the bombing. For anybody who, I know a lot of the questions are going to be, well, if we're supporting ISIS, why are we bombing them, right? So look at the first bombing situation that took place in Iraq. There were these Yazidis who were trapped on a mountaintop because ISIS had taken over the village. I'm sorry?
We all remember this because we went in, right, to drop supplies and then, okay, I'm with you.
Yeah, and a lot of it went to ISIS, by the way. But these guys were trapped on Mount Sinjar. And what you hear is the United States comes in and they bomb ISIS, and now the Yazidis are freed, right? But what you weren't told was the fact that the United States did not bomb around Mount Sinjar. They bombed in Erbil, and that's on the other side of the country. That's eastern Iraq is Erbil, and Mount Sinjar is sort of central eastern Iraq. And why did they bomb Erbil? They bombed Erbil because ISIS was getting close to Exxon and BP's oil installations in Erbil, which is where their sort of headquarters are for a number of their operations there. So they drove them back from there. What happened on Mount Sinjar was that it was Syrian Kurds who crossed the border and got the Yazidis off of the mountaintop, and that wasn't reported. So what's happening in Syria now with the bombing campaigns, if you'll look at where the United States is bombing, it is not ISIS headquarters. It is Syrian oil refineries. It is grain silos, right? So one of the biggest areas they bombed was Deir el-Zor. This is the sixth largest city in Syria. They bombed the oil installations there. If you'd been following the situation in detail up to that point, you would have known that Assad was about to retake Deir el-Zor. So what happened was after a year or so of intense battles and intense fights over Deir el-Zor, the United States came in and bombed the oil refineries right before Assad could get to it. So there's nothing to take back. The spoils, the strategic significance is largely reduced. The Syrian grain silos, in order to kill ISIS, right? They may have hit one ISIS fighter. They killed about 15 civilians, but they blew up food storage. And what does that do, right? You're causing an increased burden on the civilians. You're causing an increased burden on the Assad government. Even Amash, Justin Amash, he was in Congress when they were debating the decision to bomb ISIS or to use military force. And Amash said, this is not a plan to fight ISIS. This is a plan to fight Assad. And that's exactly what it was when they were trying to determine whether or not they wanted to arm the rebellion, the moderate rebels. And of course, that means ISIS. So
yes. We're gonna take a quick break, and we're gonna come right back. I have more questions for you. Boy, I wish you could stay like 3 more hours. This is great. We really appreciate this, Brandon. Stay on board. We're gonna go off to a break. And by the way, Interstate Battery, go to interstatebatteries.com or call 1-800-CRANK-IT to get that outrageously dependable battery. We'll be right back. You're listening to Fox News, The Perspective Show. Welcome, Brandon Turbeville.
Hey.
Absolutely glad to have you on board today.
You back.
Yeah, this is so fascinating to me because we've been discussing this. I really like your take on it, and I really like what you have to say. There was an article by Larry Chin in Lew Rockwell, and this is what he said. He said, Islamic terrorism stops the minute that its sponsors at CIA, MI, and ISI stop using it. The war itself stops when the elites who have planned this final solution to seize control over the last remaining oil supplies on the planet, the very lifeblood of the Anglo-American Empire, stop and give up their war of conquest and greed. What do you think?
I think that's absolutely correct. And I think when people look at the situation on the ground and they say, well, what do we do about it? I think the answer is pretty clear, and that's stop funding it, stop directing it, stop arming it, work with Bashar al-Assad. He's your best friend if you're against terrorism. And it would also be helpful if we told our friends in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Kuwait to stop it as well. Remember, Saudi Arabia has chopped off more heads than ISIS has in the last month, and probably
more.
Yeah, a lot more. They have a chop square, there in Saudi Arabia. So it's a ingrained part of the system. It's a monarchy. If you talk about democracy, my God, look at Saudi Arabia. There is no democracy. There's not even the pretense. Same in Qatar and Kuwait. Right? These are emirs, kings, and royal families. It's beyond hypocritical to say that these people are our allies because they're democratic, and that's certainly not the case.
This has been a lot. We've talked about this on the show, but this has been brought up a lot, is the Islamic State versus Muslims. Even Ben Affleck was in the news spouting off about whatever he believes in. What is your take on that issue? What is your take?
Well, I think, the idea, there's a lot of people who are trying to promote a lot of division amongst everybody else in terms of Christians and Jews and Muslims. And I think using the Islamic State, I think Obama made a statement recently that he said that the Islamic State wasn't Islamic. And of course, he got wildly attacked. And what he should have been attacked for was funding the Islamic State, not for making that statement, because while it's used as Islamic veneer, this is not the representation of Islam. And I keep hearing the question, if Muslims are peaceful, if Muslims oppose Islamic terrorism, why aren't they speaking out? My answer to that is they did, and you killed them, you bombed them, and you funded terrorists to go in and slaughter them. Look at Iraq, right? Had a big Christian population, and they're gone now, not because of Saddam Hussein, but because of the United States. Look at what's happening in Syria. That's not Bashar al-Assad that did that. That's not the Muslims in Syria. They didn't have the Takfiri religious fanatic Muslims that are roaming the streets today. They didn't have that. It was very few and far between. But Assad protected the minorities, the Christians, the Druze, the Jews, the other minorities, and so forth there in Syria. He protected them. And what did we do? We tried to overthrow him. The same thing in Libya. Right. So, it's not a representation of Islam. And all of this is an attempt to get people in the West in their own, Christian jihad to be prepared to get up and suit up and go fight wars for the bankers under the basis of religion. And that, to me, is despicable.
Yeah, many are speaking out against it. I just read the other day about his big Islamic conference in London, where the imams from all over were condemning the violence that ISIS was causing. The jihadists. And they didn't even believe they were true Muslims.
Yeah,
and, look. So you see that everywhere. It's just that I think your major news media doesn't let their voices be heard too much.
Yeah, I mean they've killed more Muslims than any other group over there. So it's not just Shiites either that they're killing. They've killed plenty of Sunnis as well. The division is, again, these people are, especially at the bottom, they're not bright. They're not smart people. They're insane. They're psychopaths. They're either mercenaries or they're just borderline retarded. I mean, I'm not using that to be
right.
mean. I mean, a lot of these guys can't read. They can't think. Make basic decisions on their own. There was a journalist who was kidnapped by these guys, and she was asking them, how can you reconcile the fact that you get money from the United States and you get money from Israel and you get money from Saudi Arabia and with your ideology? And they said, what do you mean? We don't get money from those guys. We fund ourselves. They didn't even know where their funding came, right? So,
yeah.
What do you think is going to happen over here next? Do you think there'll be any false flags, some events happening here that'll be blamed on the situation? What do you see happening in America?
It's quite possible. I saw this early on, and I considered whether or not, we saw Dick Cheney when he said that, what if an ISIS terrorist were to put a nuclear weapon on the back of a flatbed truck and drive it outside the Beltway and detonate it? That's pretty specific there, Dick. And
yeah.
Lindsey Graham here in South Carolina said that, yes, Miss Lindsey said if we didn't bomb ISIS or bomb Syria, then ISIS would blow up Charleston Harbor. And
it's pretty specific, isn't it?
Yeah, and we've had a number of these. And then we had this volley of reports from the Western media here in the U.S. saying that there were ISIS cells here and they were going to try to slip in nuclear weapons and detonated in Syria, in major cities. And then you look at all of the television shows and movies that have been put out over the last decade, but especially in recent years, about terrorists detonating nuclear weapons in major cities, and then you get martial law and so forth. And it is very concerning because this is the same type of propaganda that you see before other large terrorist attacks. And we've seen that happen on 9/11, for instance.
I'm beginning to think, though, I'm not sure about that, because I think that the Western ideology, or what our goals are, the CIA and et cetera, they've got the ball rolling pretty good now. They're talking about setting up the no-fly zones and everything else, and they're moving on all fronts. And it's usually that they do a false flag just to give us all a kick in the pants to get us behind them. But I think a lot of Americans don't care what they're doing anymore. They're just sort of giving them free rein to do what they want.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, at some point, I've wondered whether or not they even need to do it anymore. They could just kind of do whatever they want. But again, a lot of the repercussions that would come from a false flag would be domestic and not necessarily even overseas. Right. So you'd probably need to give us a kick in the pants if we were going to accept martial law, or even greater levels of martial law than we're in now. I mean, you look at the police, and I would consider that a form of martial law, the way we conduct ourselves in terms of security in this country. But
all the executive orders are set up right now to where martial law occurs and you lose everything. I mean, they can virtually come in and take anything that you own, which is a scary state. That's a scary premise. Absolutely. So. Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, my concern, I just watched in the news RT today and yesterday, and the Turks are trying to keep the Kurds from crossing the border to go back into Syria to fight. There's a lot of Kurds that want to go back in now that they've got them on the run. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. Well, what Turkey is afraid of is that the Kurds. Remember, the Kurds in Iraq and the Kurds in Syria have asserted themselves, especially the Syrian ones. They've been pretty good fighters against ISIS, and the Iraqi Kurds have been pretty sturdy as well. They're concerned that the Kurds in Turkey are going to unite with the Kurds in Iraq and Syria and form Kurdistan out of Turkey and of course Syria and Iraq. So they want to keep the Kurds under control as much as possible. So this is the benefit of working with your friends in NATO and Washington, is that you get sold a bill of goods and told that you'll be the next Ataturk and next Ottoman Empire, and then you work with these guys, and what happens is you end up getting Kurdistan carved out of your own country. So good job, Erdogan. But
wow, it's crazy. I honestly think heads are exploding out there, and I'm so glad to have you on the show. And I really hope you'll come back. You will come back, Brandon, right? Because
absolutely.
There are volumes of things that we could talk about, and there's other books too. Name your books, Brandon, that people can pick up.
Well, the ones you mentioned earlier, Codex Alimentarius, The End of Health Freedom, 7 Real Conspiracies, and what I would consider the most important one would be The Road to Damascus, The Anglo-American Assault on Syria. And this was written about a year ago, or maybe 2 years now, but it started from the beginning. So if you want to see what happens at the beginning of the Syrian destabilization and try to catch up on it, that'd be a good place to start.
Wow. And your website, BrandonTurbeville.com.
That's
correct?
Right. BrandonTurbeville.com. I've got a show on UCY once a week as well, so people could check that out.
Trackers, what's it called?
It's called Truth on the Tracks over at UCY.tv. And again, my website is BrandonTurbeville.com, and they can go to that website and they'll see the links to all the articles for activist posts and the anti-media as well. All that stuff's put on my website, BrandonTurbeville.com.
Brandon, I so appreciate your time. I'm so sad that we're out of time because there's so many other questions I have for you, but you've just got to come back on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Brandon. All right.
Thank you, Brandon.
We've got to go off to a break, and we will be back right after this.